I married Damien Moretti to destroy him. That sounds dramatic, I know, like something a woman says right before she loses her mind or her freedom, but on the morning I became his wife, I still believed revenge could be clean, precise, surgical. I believed pain could be measured the way rain measured itself against the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's, each drop sliding down in silver lines while Manhattan held its breath outside. I stood in the bridal suite on the second floor of the church, staring at my reflection in a mirror framed with old gold, and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. The silk gown was simple, expensive, nothing like the dress I might have chosen if this had been real. My hair was pinned low at the nape of my neck. My makeup was soft, controlled, the kind that made grief look elegant. Around my wrist, hidden beneath ivory fabric, I wore the thin silver bracelet my brother used to joke was cheap enough to turn my skin green. It hadn't. It had outlasted him. That was the problem with the dead. They left you with objects and questions and an anger too heavy to carry in public. Ethan had been gone for 11 months, and every answer I'd found led to Damien Moretti's name like the city itself bent around him. His clubs, his charities, his stealing glass towers, his picture in business magazines with that calm, unreadable face and those cold gray eyes that looked like they had never once asked for forgiveness. People called him many things in whispers. Ruthless, untouchable, dangerous. I called him the reason I stopped sleeping. A soft knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Miss Bennett. My throat tightened at my old name. 5 more minutes before it disappeared into his world. I pressed my palms against the vanity and breathed in the scent of roses and candle wax and expensive perfume that didn't belong to me. This wasn't a wedding. It was an arrangement built on lies wearing white. Damien needed a wife for reasons men like him always had reasons for. Optics, alliances, power, a polished image for rooms where criminals called themselves investors. And I needed proximity, access, his trust, if he had any to give. I had agreed to every condition without flinching. Public appearances, private discretion, a 1-year marriage with no questions asked. He must have thought I was desperate. Maybe I was. Grief makes desperation look respectable if you dress it well enough. I still remember the first time I saw him in person, 3 weeks before the ceremony, when I walked into his office on the 42nd floor and found him standing in front of a wall of glass, one hand in his pocket, the city spread beneath him like something he owned. He had turned slowly, taken me in with one steady glance, and said, "If you marry me, Claire, you don't get to be afraid halfway through." I should have walked out then. Instead, I lifted my chin and lied straight to his face. "I'm not afraid of you." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "That makes one of us reckless." Downstairs, the organ began to play, low and solemn and final. My pulse stumbled. Somewhere beyond the door, guests were rising to their feet. Somewhere beyond the church walls, cameras waited in the rain. And somewhere beneath the silk, the vows, the diamonds he had sent without a note, I carried a single truth like a blade pressed flat against my ribs. I was not walking toward love. I was walking toward the man I blamed for ruining my life. What I didn't know then, what would cost me everything before this was over, was that Damien Moretti had looked at me once and already understood I was not there to be his bride. I was there to be his reckoning. The first thing I learned about being Damien Moretti's wife was that nobody asked whether I was comfortable. They asked whether I needed sparkling or still water, whether the temperature in the car suited me, whether I preferred the penthouse in Manhattan or the estate in Westchester, but comfort was never the point. Control was. The church doors had barely closed behind us before I was guided through a private side entrance beneath a wall of black umbrellas and into the back seat of a long black sedan that smelled like leather, cedar, and money old enough to stop apologizing for itself. I sat with my hands folded too tightly in my lap, staring at the blur of Fifth Avenue through rain-streaked glass while the city moved around us in wet gray smears of headlights and brake lights. Damien sat across from me instead of beside me, as if even in a car he needed distance measured on his own terms. He had removed his tie, loosened the top button of his white shirt, and somehow looked more dangerous for the lack of polish, not less. His wedding band caught the passing light each time he checked his phone. Mine felt heavier than it should have, a narrow circle of platinum that had become a public promise and a private mistake in less than an hour. "You have been quiet," he said at last, his voice low and even. the kind that never needed help being heard. I looked up from my hands. It has been a busy day. One dark eyebrow lifted a fraction. You can do better than that. Outside, the rain hit the windows in restless bursts. I told myself not to flinch. Would you prefer honesty? I always prefer honesty, he said, and the calm certainty in his face made the statement feel less like a virtue than a test. Fine, I said. I think this is insane. I think your guests smiled like they were attending a merger instead of a wedding. Your security team has better posture than half the men in Washington, and I still do not understand why a man like you needed to marry a woman like me. He watched me for a long second, unreadable. A woman like you. His tone turned thoughtful, almost amused. And what kind is that, Claire? I should have lied. I should have given him something polished and harmless. Instead, I stared straight back at him and said, the kind who does not belong here. For the first time all day, something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Not exactly. More like interest sharpened by recognition. That, he said quietly, depends on what you think here is. The car turned downtown, smooth as a blade. When we pulled into the underground garage beneath his building, two men in dark coats were already waiting. They opened doors before the engine fully stopped. Nobody touched me, but every movement around me had the unmistakable precision of people trained to anticipate danger before it introduced itself. We rode to the penthouse in silence, the elevator walls gleaming bronze around us, my reflection trapped beside his in every polished surface. He was taller than I remembered from the church aisle, broader too, all clean, lines and controlled force, the kind of man who looked made for expensive suits and impossible decisions. When the doors opened, I forgot to breathe. The penthouse was less an apartment than a statement. Floor-to-ceiling glass revealed the Manhattan skyline in 1,000 blurred lights. The living room was all cream stone, dark wood, and art that looked like it had opinions about the people who bought it. Somewhere deeper inside, jazz played so softly it felt like part of the air. This will be your home, Damien said. I let out a quiet laugh before I could stop myself. Home is a generous word. He turned to face me then, fully, his expression cooling by degrees until even the room seemed to notice. Do not mistake generosity for confusion, he said. You asked for my name. You stood beside me and took it. Whatever reasons brought you to that altar, whatever story you are telling yourself tonight, understand this clearly. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to make the distance matter. You are under my protection now, and in my world, that means something. I should have felt safer. Instead, I felt seen in a way that made my pulse trip hard against my throat, because men like Damien Moretti did not make promises unless they planned to keep them, and I was beginning to understand that the most dangerous part of marrying him was not the power he had. It was how calmly he carried it. That night, I did not sleep. I changed out of silk and satin in a guest suite the size of my old apartment, then stood barefoot in front of a wall of glass with the lights off, watching rain slide down the windows while the city glittered below like a promise nobody had any intention of keeping. Somewhere beyond the closed door, Damien's world kept moving. Phones vibrated. Elevators whispered. Footsteps passed and faded. Even 40 stories above the street, power had a sound. Low, controlled, constant. I wrapped my arms around myself and told myself I had made it this far for a reason. Get close. Stay useful. Find the truth. It sounded simple when I repeated it in my head, but nothing about Damien Moretti felt simple up close. By midnight, I gave up pretending I would rest and went looking for water, following a soft line of recessed lighting down a hallway that seemed designed to remind visitors how small they were. The penthouse was quiet in the deliberate way expensive places often are, every surface clean, every room composed, as if even chaos needed permission to enter. I found the kitchen first, all dark marble and brushed brass, the refrigerator hidden behind paneled walls. I had just poured a glass when a voice behind me said, "Most people ask before they start wandering." I turned too fast and nearly spilled the water. Damien stood in the doorway without a jacket, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his tie gone, one hand resting loosely in his pocket. He looked less like the groom from the church and more like the man beneath the ceremony. Sharper somehow, more dangerous for having nothing left to perform. I was thirsty, I said, and I did not realize I needed a map to find a kitchen. His gaze dropped to the glass in my hand, then lifted back to my face. If you wanted something, All you had to do was ask. I'm trying not to make a habit of that. A faint smile touched his mouth and vanished so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. He crossed to the counter, poured himself espresso from a machine that probably cost more than my first car, and leaned one shoulder against the marble like he had all the time in the world. You are determined to hate this place. I am determined not to be impressed by it. That is not the same thing. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not empty either. I took a sip of water I did not want just to have something to do with my hands. Up close, the kitchen smelled like coffee, polished wood, and the clean sharpness of rain each time the ventilation shifted. He studied me the way he had in his office weeks ago, patient and exact, as if every answer I might give mattered less than the moment before it. You keep waiting for me to become the man you expected, he said at last. My fingers tightened around the glass. And what man is that? The one you decided I was before you ever met me. I set the glass down too quickly. The sound against stone was small, but in that room it felt loud. You do not know what I decided. No, he said, voice calm. But I know what grief looks like when it is dressed as courage. The words hit too close. For one reckless second, I hated him for seeing it. I hated the steadiness in his face, the infuriating control, the way he said hard things without raising his voice. Do not talk to me like you understand me, I said. He straightened then, not angry, just absolute. Claire, I do not need to understand everything about you to recognize that you walked into my life carrying a reason. When you are ready to tell me what it is, I will listen. My pulse stumbled. He could not know. He could not possibly know. And yet standing there under warm kitchen light with the storm pressing at the windows and his eyes fixed on mine, I felt the first cold fracture in my certainty. Because Damien was not asking for trust. He was offering patience. And that was far more dangerous than fear. By the third day, I understood the rhythm of Damien Moretti's world well enough to know it was built on timing. Breakfast appeared at 7 whether I asked for it or not. A driver waited downstairs by 8. Fresh flowers arrived every morning in the entry hall, always white, always replaced before a single petal had the chance to fall. Even the silence in the penthouse felt scheduled. It should have made me feel secure. Instead, it made me feel watched. Not in the obvious way, though there was always a man near the elevator and another by the lobby desk downstairs, both too well dressed to be called security out loud. It was subtler than that. The way the staff knew when I preferred coffee over tea before I ever said it. The way my closet filled overnight with dresses and shades I might actually choose, as if someone had studied me and sent the findings to Madison Avenue. The way Damien never asked where I had been after an outing, but somehow always knew. He was not caging me. He was curating me. And somehow that felt more dangerous. So I adapted. I smiled when cameras appeared. I took his arm at charity lunches and gallery openings, and one painfully elegant dinner on the Upper East Side, where old money pretended not to stare while new power entered the room in a tailored black suit and a wife no one could place. I learned which forks mattered and which women traded compliments like polished knives. I learned that people feared Damien most when he spoke softly. I learned that when he rested a hand at the small of my back in public, the room shifted around us without anyone acknowledging why. And I learned that pretending to belong was easier in heels and pearls than it should have been. That was the part one hated most. Every event gave me something. A name. A whispered alliance. A company buried inside 3 others. I kept the details in my head until I could write them down in the Notes app on an old phone I hid at the back of a drawer beneath winter scarves I no longer needed in March. Import records. Shipping routes. Foundation board members. A law firm in Midtown that handled private acquisitions for Moretti Holdings and 3 shell companies with ties I could not yet prove. None of it was enough, but it was movement, and movement felt like hope. One Thursday afternoon, Damien took me to a luncheon for a children's hospital expansion on the West Side. I expected polished donors and empty speeches. I did not expect him to stay nearly an hour after the cameras left, speaking quietly with nurses, listening to a mother in a faded blue sweater describe her son's treatment schedule like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. He did not perform concern. He paid attention. Real attention. The kind you cannot fake if you are in a hurry to be admired. I stood near the windows with a glass of sparkling water I did not touch and watched him kneel beside a little girl in a hospital chair so he could hear her without making her look up. He said something that made her laugh. Soft. Quick. Honest. It unsettled me more than any threat could have. Because monsters were easier. Monsters let you keep your anger neat and bright and unchallenged. But men who funded hospital wings and remembered a nurse's name and still carried that cold, unshakable authority into every room were harder to hate cleanly. When we left, the March wind cut through Manhattan like broken glass, sharp and damp off the river. Damien opened the car door for me himself, one hand braced against the roof to shield me from the rain starting up again. "You are staring," he said once the door shut behind us. I looked away toward the blurred skyline. "Maybe I am trying to figure you out." He adjusted the cuff of his coat, expression unreadable. "That sounds exhausting." I should have said something sharper. Instead, I heard myself ask, "Do you ever do anything without a reason?" His eyes met mine across the dim leather interior, steady as ever. "No," he said. Then, after a beat that felt longer than it should have, he added, "But not all reasons are ugly, Claire." And for the rest of the drive home, with rain tracing silver lines down the windows and the city disappearing behind them, I could not stop thinking about how dangerous it was that I was starting to believe him. The file changed everything, and I found it by accident. At least that is what I told myself later, when I tried to remember the exact moment the ground shifted beneath me. It was a Tuesday evening, cold enough that the windows of the penthouse had gone faintly silver at the edges, the kind of March night when Manhattan looked beautiful from a distance and exhausted up close. Damien had not returned yet. A meeting in Tribeca, according to Elena, the house manager, who always spoke with the careful neutrality of someone who understood too much and revealed nothing. I was in his study because I had spent the last 2 weeks teaching myself the geography of his world. Which drawers locked, which shelves were decorative, which cabinets held liquor, and which held paper. The room itself was exactly what I should have expected from him. Dark walnut shelves, clean lines, no clutter, one wall of books arranged with the precision of a man who hated waste in all its forms. The desk was immaculate except for a silver pen, a leather folder, and a crystal tumbler with exactly 1 inch of amber liquid left at the bottom. I should have left everything untouched. Instead, I opened the folder. Inside were reports from a private security firm, summaries of financial transfers, copies of contracts with enough redactions to make them feel more important than they looked. My pulse stayed steady. I had seen fragments like this before. Useful, but not enough. Then a single page slipped sideways and landed on the floor. I bent to retrieve it, and the name near the bottom stopped me so fast my knees nearly gave out. Ethan Bennett. My brother's name looked wrong in that room. Too plain and human against all that expensive control. I stared at it until the letters blurred, then forced myself to keep reading. It was not a contract, not a debt ledger. It was an internal report, dated 11 months ago, marked confidential, summarizing a breach in one of Damien's shipping operations in Red Hook. My breath caught as I scanned line after line. Ethan had not worked for Damien. He had not been targeted by Damien. He had been used by someone else entirely, a man named Victor Salazar, one of Damien's own senior advisors, who had routed information through a civilian intermediary without authorization. Ethan had seen something he was never supposed to see. He had panicked. He had tried to come forward. And then he had disappeared from the timeline of the report as neatly as a candle being pinched out. At the bottom, in Damien's handwriting, were 6 words that made my stomach drop all the way to the floor. "Find Salazar before Claire Bennett does." I read them 3 times. 4. My hands had started shaking by then, not delicately, not in some graceful movie version of shock, but hard enough that the paper rattled against my fingers. He knew my name before I ever entered his office. He knew about Ethan. Worse, he had not been hiding his guilt. He had been hiding someone else's. A sound behind me made every nerve in my body seize. "That," Damien said quietly, "was not how I wanted you to learn it." I turned too fast, clutching the page like it might hold me upright. He stood in the doorway in a charcoal coat, rain still darkening the shoulders, his expression unreadable except for the weariness at the edges. No anger, no surprise, just a kind of stillness that made the room feel smaller. "You knew," I whispered. My voice did not sound like mine. "From the beginning, you knew who I was." "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, and somehow that hurt more than if he had lied. "And Ethan?" My throat tightened around the name. "You knew what happened to Ethan." He stepped inside, slow enough not to crowd me. I knew he was used by a man I once trusted. I knew you blamed me, and I knew that if I gave you the truth too early, you would never stay long enough to survive it. I should have hated him then. Maybe part of me did. But standing there in the warm light of his study with my brother's name trembling in my hands and Damien looking at me like he had been waiting for this storm from the day we met, all I could feel was the terrifying crack of certainty breaking open. Because revenge had brought me to his door. But truth, cold and irreversible, had just made me realize I had married the wrong enemy. For a long time, neither of us moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him, and somewhere in the penthouse the low hum of the city pressed at the glass like a second heartbeat, distant and sleepless. I still had the page in my hand, crumpled now from how tightly I was holding it. Ethan's name bent across the center like grief itself had reached up and touched the paper. "You let me marry you," I said. Each word came out thin and unsteady. "You knew I hated you, and you let me stand in a church and promise myself to a man I believed destroyed my brother." Damien's face did not change, but something in his eyes darkened, not with anger, with something heavier. "You are not a woman anyone lets do anything, Claire." The answer should have infuriated me. Instead, it landed with the unbearable weight of truth. He had not tricked me into walking toward him. I had chosen it. Out of grief. Out of rage. Out of desperation so sharp it had made recklessness feel noble. I set the report down on the desk because my hands could no longer hold it steady. "Then tell me everything," I said. "No half-truths. No more choosing for me. If I am in this now, I want the truth exactly as it is." For the first time since I had known him, Damien looked almost tired. Not weaker, not less controlled, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and crossed to the windows before turning back toward me. The city lights framed him in silver and charcoal, making him look less like a husband and more like the sort of man history would remember badly and need anyway. "Victor Salazar handled logistics for me for 6 years," he said. "Smart, disciplined, useful. He built loyalty in quiet ways. Paid the right people. Knew which deals to keep away from my desk unless they mattered. I trusted him farther than I should have." His voice stayed level, but each word felt measured against old disappointment. 11 months ago, he moved information through unofficial channels to cover a private arrangement he thought would never reach me. Your brother saw enough to become a liability to men who prefer shadows to questions. My chest tightened so hard I had to look away. Ethan, always too curious, always convinced the right truth in the wrong room, could still save somebody. Did Salazar? I stopped, swallowed, tried again. Did he give the order? Damien held my gaze. I believe he set events in motion and let fear do the rest. I believe Ethan tried to pull away once he understood what he had stumbled into. And I believe Salazar has been hiding behind other men ever since. I closed my eyes for 1 second, then opened them because if I started breaking now, I was not sure I would stop. "And me?" I asked. "Where do I fit into all of this?" The room went very still. Damien took a step closer, enough that his voice dropped, softer now, more dangerous because of it. "The moment I learned Ethan had a sister, I had people watching to make sure Salazar did not reach you first." My breath caught. "Watching me, protecting you, without telling me. Would you have thanked me if I had?" No, I knew that. He knew that. It did not make the admission easier to bear. I turned away from him and braced my hands against the edge of the desk, willing my pulse to slow. "So what now?" I whispered. "Do I go on smiling beside you at fundraisers while the man who used my brother keeps breathing easy somewhere in your city?" Damien did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice came from closer than I expected, low and absolute behind me. "No. Now you stop chasing ghosts alone." I turned. Then, and for one reckless second, there was nothing in the room except the storm in my chest and the certainty in his eyes. "Claire," he said, using my name like it mattered, like it always had. "You came to me for revenge. I am offering you the truth instead. But if you stay in this with me, you do not get to lie to me again." The words should have felt like a command. They felt like a line being drawn. Not between us, around us. And standing there in the quiet ruin of everything I thought I knew, I realized the choice in front of me was no longer whether to hate Damien Moretti. It was whether I trusted him enough to help me bury the right man. The next week moved like a held breath. Nothing outward changed. I still wore the right dresses. Still smiled for cameras. still sat beside Damien at private dinners where men with perfect cufflinks talked about market expansion and waterfront redevelopment as if they were discussing weather instead of power. But underneath it all, the ground had shifted. I was no longer looking for proof against him. I was learning the shape of the enemy beside him. Damien did not explain every move, and I stopped expecting him to. Instead, he gave me pieces, names that appeared too often. A company in Newark tied to Salazar through 2 layers of legal fiction. A townhouse in Brooklyn used for meetings that never appeared on official calendars. A charity gala invitation delivered by hand instead of email, which Damien studied for exactly 3 seconds before saying, "He is getting nervous." I stood across from him in the dressing room that opened off the primary suite, fastening diamond earrings I had not asked for and still was not sure how to feel about. "How can you tell?" He adjusted his watch, expression calm. "Because men like Victor only become generous when they are afraid someone has stopped believing them." The gala was at a private mansion on the Upper East Side. All limestone steps, white floral arrangements, and security discreet enough to make ordinary people think they were safe. I arrived on Damien's arm in a black dress, so simple it made everyone else look overdressed, my hair swept back, my pulse much too loud in my own ears. The moment we entered, I felt it. Attention, not public curiosity, something narrower, intentional. Damien felt it too. His hand settled lightly at my back, not possessive, not for show. "A warning. Stay near me tonight," he said without looking down. "That sounds less like a request." "Good." We moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping for donors, board members, politicians, women who kissed the air near my cheek and called me lovely as though we had all agreed to pretend. Then I saw him. Victor Salazar stood near the far end of the ballroom with a glass of champagne and the relaxed smile of a man who thought he had perfected innocence. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, navy tuxedo, the kind of face people trusted because it looked grandfatherly under expensive lighting. My stomach turned cold. "Do not," Damien murmured, reading the shift in me without needing to ask. "Not yet." Victor approached us 10 minutes later as if summoned by bad luck itself. "Damien," he said warmly. "And Claire, you look radiant tonight." I had imagined this moment too many times. Rage, trembling hands, some dramatic collapse of restraint. Instead, I heard my own voice come out smooth and distant. "That is kind of you, Mr. Salazar." His eyes lingered on me one beat too long. Not admiration, calculation. "I was sorry to hear about your brother," he said softly. "Such a tragic situation." Every muscle in my body locked. Damien answered before I could. "We do not discuss family losses at fundraisers, Victor." The air changed. Barely, but I felt it. So did Victor. His smile remained, though his eyes sharpened. "Of course," he said. "My apologies." He drifted away a minute later, but the damage was done. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. On the drive home, I stared out at Park Avenue sliding by in ribbons of gold and rain and tried to steady my breathing. "He wanted to see whether I knew," I said. Damien sat beside me this time, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched mine when the car turned. "Yes." "And now?" His answer came quiet and immediate. "Now he will move faster." I finally looked at him. City light caught the hard line of his jaw, the silver edge of his watch, the calm that never seemed to leave him even when the room caught fire around everyone else. "You told me to stop chasing ghosts alone," I said. "So tell me the truth. If Salazar moves, what does that mean for me?" Damien's gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. "It means," he said, "that from this moment on, I do not let you out of my sight." And for the first time since this began, those words did not feel like a cage. They felt like the only honest thing in the room. Salazar moved on a Friday. Of course he did. Bad men always preferred the end of the week, when offices emptied early and the city convinced itself it was relaxing. The rain had finally stopped after 3 straight days, leaving Manhattan washed clean on the surface and filthy underneath, every sidewalk reflecting silver under a pale 6 o'clock sky. Damien had spent the afternoon in a meeting downtown and insisted I remain at the penthouse until he returned. I agreed more easily than I would have a month earlier, which should have frightened me more than it did. By then I knew the difference between control and caution, and Damien had stopped pretending they were the same thing. I was in the library with a book open on my lap and not a single page absorbed when Elena appeared at the doorway. composed as always except for the slightest tension around her eyes. "Mrs. Moretti," she said softly, "there is a delivery downstairs." "Flowers." "No card." I frowned. Damien never sent flowers without a reason, and he was not careless enough to send them without a note. "From whom?" The driver said they came through a private messenger service. Something cold moved through me. "Tell them to leave them with the concierge." Elena nodded once. "I already did." She turned to go, then paused. "There is one more thing. The messenger asked whether you still visit St. Andrew's on Lexington." My blood went still. St. Andrew's was the church where Ethan used to light candles for our mother every November. It was not public. It was not something Damien's social circle would know. "Where is Damien?" I asked. "On his way." I was already standing. "Call him again." Elena moved fast then, no wasted motion, one hand lifting the phone at her side. I crossed the room with my pulse pounding in my throat, so hard it hurt. The city outside the windows looked suddenly too large, the avenues below too open, every yellow cab and black-town car part of a pattern I could no longer read. My phone buzzed before I reached the hallway. "Damien." I answered on the first ring. "Claire, listen carefully." No greeting. No softness. Just that low, controlled voice sharpened to an edge I had never heard before. "You are not to leave the penthouse. Not for any reason. Do you understand me? He knows about St. Andrew's." Silence. One beat. Then, "I know." Fear swept through me so quickly it almost made me sit down. "How?" "Because Salazar just made contact with a second intermediary tied to Ethan's old building in Queens. We picked it up 10 minutes ago. Picked it up. Monitored. Anticipated." Damien had been 3 moves ahead and still sounded like it was not enough. "What does he want?" My voice came out thinner than I intended. "He wants you unsettled," Damien said. "He wants you to move before I can close the distance. That means he is running out of places to hide." I reached the end of the hallway and stopped beside the entry table where those white flowers were replaced every morning. My fingers pressed into the marble edge. "Then let him run." Another silence, shorter this time. "Claire." He said my name differently when something mattered. Less like a warning, more like a hand closing around a promise. "There is something I need you to know in case tonight gets complicated." I closed my eyes for half a second. "Do not say that like it is a goodbye." "It is not." His voice lowered. "But I should have told you sooner. I knew you married me for revenge the first time you walked into my office. I saw it in your face before you ever sat down." I let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, broken and disbelieving. "And you married me anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Outside, a helicopter passed low over the East River, its sound dull through reinforced glass. When he answered, the words came without hesitation. "Because you were the only person in that room who looked at me and wanted the truth more than my power." My throat tightened so suddenly I had to grip the table harder. "Damien." "Stay inside," he said, the command back in his voice now, but under it was something rawer, rarer. "I am coming home." The line went dead. 10 minutes later, the private elevator chimed. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. I turned toward the foyer just as the doors opened and Damien stepped out, coat unbuttoned, jaw set, eyes already searching for me like the room had only one purpose. I had imagined 100 endings to this story before I ever married him. Revenge, exposure, escape. None of them looked like this. None of them felt like the terrifying relief that hit my chest the second I saw him standing there, alive and furious in here. He crossed the marble floor in 6 quick strides and stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could smell rain and cold air clinging to his coat. "Did anyone else contact you?" he asked. I shook my head. "Only the flowers." He glanced toward the hallway where Elena waited discreetly out of sight, then back at me. "Good. That is not enough for me anymore," I said, surprising both of us with how steady I sounded. "I am done being protected like porcelain. If Salazar is forcing this to the surface, then stop shutting me out of the last part of it." Damien looked at me for one long second, the kind that changed things. Then he reached into his coat and handed me a folded sheet of paper. An address in Brooklyn. A time. A meeting scheduled for later that night. Salazar's name nowhere on the page, but present in every line anyway. "This is where he thinks he still has leverage," Damien said. "By midnight, he will learn otherwise." I looked up from the paper to his face. "And me?" He held my gaze, gray eyes steady as winter water. "You stay with me," he said. "Not because I do not trust you. Because tonight, I need you where I can see you choose. And standing there beneath the soft gold lights of the penthouse, with danger finally stepping out of the shadows and the truth between us stripped bare, I realized the choice in front of me was no longer whether I had married the wrong man. It was whether I was brave enough to stand beside the right one when the night asked for a price. We drove to Brooklyn just before 11 in a convoy quiet enough to make the whole city feel like it was listening. The address on Damien's paper led to an old waterfront building in Red Hook, the kind of place developers described as promising because they had not been there after dark. The East River wind cut sharp between the warehouses, carrying salt, diesel, and the distant hum of traffic from the expressway. I sat in the back seat beside Damien with my coat pulled tight and my pulse moving too fast for the stillness he wore so easily. He had said very little on the drive over. Not because he was shutting me out, because he was concentrating, every part of him narrowed toward the same point. I understood that now. Power was loud in public. In private, it became silence. The car rolled to a stop beneath a dead streetlight. Ahead, the building stood in shadow except for one second-floor office with a band of yellow light across the blinds. Damien looked at me then, fully, his expression unreadable in the dim interior. "You stay behind me when we go in." "I am not porcelain," I said softly. "No," he replied. "You are the reason I am here." The answer hit somewhere deeper than I was prepared for. One of the men in the front seat spoke into his earpiece, low and quick. Damien opened his door, then paused and turned back to me one last time. "Claire." I met his eyes. "Whatever happens next, do not confuse my world with my choice. You were always the latter." Then he was out of the car, and the cold came rushing in behind him. I followed anyway. The stairwell inside smelled like dust and old paint and secrets left too long in bad air. Two of Damien's men moved ahead, one behind. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. By the time we reached the second floor, the office door was already open. Victor Salazar stood at the far end of the room near a desk littered with folders, a half-finished drink, and a silver letter opener glinting beneath the overhead light. He looked smaller than I remembered from the ballroom. Older too. Fear had a way of shrinking men who depended on illusion. His eyes found me first. "Claire," he said, almost gently. "I was hoping you would come." Damien stepped in front of me with such natural certainty that it felt less like control than truth. "You do not say her name again," he said. Victor's mouth tightened. "Still pretending this is about protection?" "No," Damien said. "Now it is about consequence." The two men looked at each other for a long moment, and I felt it then, the final shape of what had been moving beneath every dinner, every lie, every polite room with expensive lighting. Betrayal was never loud at the start. It began in confidence, inconvenience, in the assumption that no one would care enough to follow the damage all the way back. Victor finally looked at me again, his expression shifting towards something like regret. "Your brother asked too many questions," he said. "I told them to keep him calm. I did not tell anyone to make things permanent." My throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe. It was not a confession polished for court. It was worse. Careless. Human. Cowardly in the exact way evil usually was. Damien's voice stayed low. "You used a civilian to cover your theft, and when it unraveled, you let a dead boy take the weight for your fear." Victor's composure cracked then, just enough. "I built half your empire, and confused that with ownership." What followed happened quickly, but not chaotically. Papers exchanged hands. A recording played from someone's phone. Names, account numbers, dates. Enough to strip Victor of whatever protection he thought he still had. I stood there with my hands cold inside my coat pockets and watched the last illusion die. Not with drama, with proof. When it was over, Victor was led away by men who no longer called him sir, and the room went quiet in the strange, emptied way it does after a storm has finally chosen somewhere else to go. I stared at the desk for a second too long until Damien came to stand beside me. "It is done," he said. I looked up at him, at the face I had once studied for guilt and now read for something far more dangerous. Steadiness. "Ethan is still gone," I whispered. "I know." There was no false comfort in his voice, and I loved him a little for that before I was ready to admit it. Outside, just past midnight, Brooklyn shimmered under a hard, clear sky. The rain was gone. The streets looked rinsed clean. Damien walked me back to the car without touching me, though I felt him there with every step, a presence as constant as the wind off the river. When we reached the open door, I did not get in. He stopped and waited, always waiting when it mattered. You said I was your choice, I said. Yes. Then give me one. Something changed in his eyes, quiet and careful. You can leave this tonight, Claire. The apartment on 71st is in your name. No strings. No men watching the door. No one will stop you. My breath caught. Any other man in his position would have called that mercy and expected gratitude. Damien offered it like truth. Clean. Unforced. Final. The city moved around us in distant sirens and red taillights and the soft rush of the river against concrete. I thought about Ethan. About grief. About revenge. About the first day I walked into Damien's office wanting to break him, and the thousand small ways he had instead taught me the difference between power and cruelty. Then I stepped closer, close enough that the cold could not fit between us anymore. I married you because I thought you were the ending, I said. I stayed because you gave me a choice. For the first time since I had known him, Damien Moretti looked almost undone. Not weak, not shattered, just human in that rare and breathtaking way power never prepares you for. He lifted one hand, slow enough for me to refuse, and brushed a strand of wind-blown hair back from my face with a gentleness that still felt impossible on him. Come home with me, he said quietly. And this time, when I stepped into his world, I did not do it for revenge. I did it because somewhere between the lies, the storm, and the truth, the man I was supposed to destroy had become the only place my heart no longer had to hide.